4:15 in the morning, the South China Sea, 90 miles east of the Paracel Islands, the USS Gerald R. was cutting, when the first alert flashed across the glass consoles in the Combat Direction Center. It was not the crisp, sharp return of a fighter jet, or the heavy bloom of a bomber. Instead, the ANSPY-6 radar suite was struggling to interpret a shimmering, shifting mass that seemed to occupy a square mile of airspace. On the tactical displays, the contact did not look like an enemy. It looked like a digital ghost, a smear of light that breathed and expanded as it closed the distance, at 300 kilometers per hour. The watch officer, a lieutenant commander with 12 years of experience in the Aegis Combat System, stared at the raw data for 3 seconds before the realization hit him like a physical blow. This was not a malfunction. It was a saturation attack. 400 individual drones, each no larger than a predator bird, were moving in a coordinated, decentralized swarm toward the center of the carrier strike group. The South China Sea was dark, the water the color of obsidian under a moonless sky, and the air was thick with the heavy humidity and the scent of salt spray that always preceded a storm. But the storm arriving this morning was made of carbon fiber and high explosives. Within seconds, the silence of the ship was shattered by the rhythmic, piercing chime of general quarters. Over the ship's internal speakers, the command echoed through every berthing area, every engine room, and every galley. All hands, man your battle stations. This is not a drill. The sound of boots clattering on steel ladders became a frantic percussion throughout the 100,000 tons of the carrier. In the Combat Direction Center, the blue light of the monitors reflected off the sweat-slicked foreheads of the operators. They were professionals, trained for the high-intensity environment of modern naval warfare, but none of them had ever seen a target like this. The swarm was flying low, hugging the surface of the water to hide within the radar clutter of the waves, emerging and disappearing, as if the ocean itself were reaching out to strike. The commanding officer of the USS Gerald R. arrived on the bridge. As the ship's defensive systems began to spool up, he looked at the primary tactical plot. The carrier was the heart of the formation, surrounded by a protective ring of 2 destroyers and the cruiser CG-73. But the ring was designed to stop missiles and aircraft, targets with high signatures and predictable flight paths. This was something else. The 400 drones were communicating with each other through a mesh network, shifting their density and direction to confuse the automated tracking algorithms of the United States Navy's most advanced warships. The air on the bridge smelled of ozone and the faint, metallic tang of the ventilation system working at maximum capacity. Outside, the flight deck was a hive of controlled chaos. Yellow shirts and purple shirts moved with practiced discipline. Taking off was absent. The catapults were cold, and the swarm was already too close for a standard intercept. The carrier was being hunted in the dark, and her only defense now lay in the layers of steel and silicon that formed her inner shield. 5 miles to the east, the destroyer DDG-51 began the engagement. The ship's SLQ-32 electronic warfare suite hammered the airwaves with a wall of noise, attempting to sever the command and control links of the swarm. For a moment, it seemed to work. A dozen drones at the edge of the formation faltered, their internal gyroscopes losing lock, causing them to tumble into the black water. But the rest of the swarm simply adjusted. The remaining 388 units tightened their formation, narrowing the gap. On the Ford, the tension was a physical weight. The crew knew that if even 10% of those drones reached the flight deck, the consequences would be catastrophic. The carrier was a floating airfield, packed with millions of gallons of JP-5 jet fuel and thousands of tons of ordnance. A single spark in the wrong place could turn the pride of the fleet into a funeral pyre. The tactical officer reported the range. 20 kilometers, closing fast. The carrier began to heel over as the helmsman executed a hard turn to starboard, putting the ship's most heavily defended sectors between the swarm and the vulnerable stern. The massive hull shuddered as the 4 propellers pushed against the resistance of the sea. The battle for the South China Sea had begun not with a roar, but with a whisper of propellers and a ghost on a screen. The question that remained, hanging in the humid night air, was whether the most powerful ship ever built could survive 1,000 tiny cuts. 4:20 in the morning. The outer escort screen of Carrier Strike Group 12. The cruiser CG-73 and the destroyer DDG-51 were positioned 3 miles ahead of the carrier, acting as the primary kinetic shield against the approaching threat. On the cruiser, the air in the ship's weapons city, the nicknamed complex of the Mark 41 vertical launch system, was heavy with the smell of hydraulic fluid and the ozone of high-voltage electronics. The deck beneath the sailors' feet hummed with a low-frequency vibration as the Aegis Combat System reached out, with its AN/SPY-6 radar, locking onto the leading edge of the swarm at a range of 30 kilometers. The commanding officer of the cruiser CG-73 stood in the center of the darkened Combat Information Center, his face illuminated by the pale blue glow of the tactical plot. The order was given with a calm, practiced tone that belied the stakes of the moment. Weapons free. Engage the lead clusters with Standard Missile 6. On the forward deck of the cruiser, the armored hatches of the Mark 41 vertical launch system snapped open in rapid succession. There was a moment of absolute stillness, followed by a series of thunderous roars that shook the entire hull of the 9,000-ton warship. White plumes of smoke erupted into the humid night air, illuminated from within by the brilliant orange glare of solid-fuel rocket motors. 8 Standard Missile, 6 interceptors shrieked into the sky, their nose cones pitching over as they searched for the tiny, fluttering radar signatures of the Chinese drones. The missiles accelerated to Mach 3.5 in seconds, trailing long fingers of white exhaust that stood out like scars against the black horizon. Each missile carried a blast fragmentation warhead designed to shred high-speed aircraft. But the drones were a different kind of target. They were small, agile, and lacked the massive heat signature of a jet engine. At 15 kilometers, the first Standard Missile 6 detonated. The proximity fuse sensed the cluster of drones and triggered a ring of tungsten shrapnel that expanded at thousands of meters per second.
Did you see that?
On the radar screens, a dozen tiny dots vanished instantly. Sending debris tumbling into the waves below. But for every drone destroyed, 30 more continued their steady, relentless advance. The swarm was not a single entity. It was a distributed intelligence, and it was already beginning to adapt to the interception patterns of the American missiles. The destroyer DDG-51 joined the engagement 3 seconds later. Her forward Mark 45 5-inch gun opened fire, sending air-bursting shells into the sky at a rate of 20 rounds per minute. The flashes of the muzzle blasts lit up the destroyer's bridge every 3 seconds, casting long, jumping shadows across the sea. The shells were fused to detonate in the path of the swarm, creating a wall of black smoke and high-velocity steel fragments. The sound across the water was a continuous, rolling thunder that could be heard for miles. The South China Sea, usually a place of deep, silent currents, was now a theater of violent energy. The smell of burnt propellant drifted across the decks of the escort ships, a sharp, chemical bite that stung the eyes of the lookouts. Despite the weight of fire being thrown into the air, the tactical situation was deteriorating. The United States Navy was using million-dollar missiles to kill drones that cost less than a used car, and the mathematics of the engagement were shifting in favor of the attacker. Inside the combat direction center of the cruiser, the tactical action officer tracked the ammunition counts. They had launched 40 Standard missiles in less than 5 minutes. The swarm had lost perhaps 60 units, but the core of the formation, over 300 drones, was now passing through the outer layer of the defense. The drones were flying so low that the radar returns were being masked by the sea spray kicked up by the wind. The commanding officer looked at the screen. The swarm was no longer a single mass. It was breaking apart into 4 distinct subgroups, maneuvers designed to force the Aegis system to divide its processing power. The drones were beginning to circle, looking for the gaps. In the coverage provided by the escort ships, they were no longer just a target. They were a predator that had found a way to slip past the shield. "The outer ring is breached," the tactical officer reported, his voice tight but controlled. "The swarm is entering the inner engagement zone. They are less than 8 miles from the carrier." The battle was moving from the long-range precision of missiles to the brutal, close-quarters chaos of point defense. The Gerald R. Ford was no longer watching the fight from a distance. The fight was coming to her. 4:25 in the morning. The inner engagement zone, 6 miles from the hull of the USS Gerald R. Ford. The swarm was no longer a cloud. It had evolved into 4 distinct, lethal talons, each numbering approximately 85 units, and approaching from different cardinal points of the compass. This was the saturation point, the moment where the sheer volume of incoming data began to challenge the processing architecture of the ANSPY-6 radar. In the Combat Direction Center, the tactical displays were a riot of yellow and red symbols, flickering, as the system struggled to maintain a continuous track on 340 independent, low-observable targets. The air in the Combat Direction Center was cooled to exactly 68 degrees Fahrenheit to protect the sensitive electronics, but the heat radiating from the massive server racks was a constant thrum. The operators sat in high-backed chairs, their fingers flying across glass touchscreens as they attempted to prioritize targets for the ship's point defense systems. The tactical action officer stared at the screen, his jaw set. The Aegis system was designed to track over 100 targets simultaneously, but the swarm was using a coordinated jitter maneuver, shifting altitude and heading every 5 seconds to force the radar to reinitiate its track. Outside on the catwalks, the humidity of the South China Sea felt like a wet wool blanket, and the air smelled of diesel exhaust and the sharp, metallic tang of the ship's massive cooling fans. The sea was dark, the waves capped with white foam. As the carrier maintained its high-speed evasive maneuvers, the 4 propellers, each the size of a 2-story house, churned the water into a boiling wake that stretched for miles behind the ship. Talons north and west are dipping below the radar horizon. The radar intercept officer called out, his voice cutting through the quiet murmur of the room. "They are hugging the wave tops at less than 10 meters. We are losing solid lock on the trailing edge of the formation." This was the strategic nightmare of the drone swarm. By flying in the radar clutter of the sea surface, the drones could remain invisible until they were less than 3 miles away, a distance that left the carrier with less than 45 seconds to respond. The commanding officer of the Gerald R. Ford watched the plot. He knew that the escort ships were already at their maximum engagement capacity. The cruiser CG-73 was busy defending its own perimeter against a subsection of the swarm, leaving the carrier to manage the primary threat alone. The ship's internal tactical network, known as the Cooperative Engagement Capability, was sharing data between every ship in the strike group, trying to form a single, coherent picture of the battlefield. But the drones were jamming the link with a localized, high-frequency signal. On the monitors, the symbols for the drones began to ghost, appearing in 2 or 3 places at once as the system's logic gates struggled to reconcile conflicting data from the different sensors. In the weapon control stations, the sailors responsible for the ship's inner shield were already authorized to engage. They were no longer waiting for a human to pull the trigger for every target. The ship had been placed into a semi-autonomous defensive mode. The Mark 41 vertical launch systems on the carrier's starboard and port sponsons were loaded with evolved Sea Sparrow missiles, designed for exactly this kind of high-agility, close-in threat. The atmosphere on the bridge was one of grim, professional focus. There were no shouts, only the rhythmic reporting of ranges and bearings. The distance was closing to 4 miles. The first of the 4 drone Talons began its final ascent, popping up from the wave tops, to gain altitude for a diving attack. The maneuver exposed them to the full power of the ANSPY-6 radar for the first time in 3 minutes. "Track initiated on Talon North," the weapons officer shouted. 30 targets locked, engaging with evolved Sea Sparrow missiles. The ship shuddered as the first cell of missiles launched from the side of the carrier. The white light of the rocket motors reflected off the sea, casting a haunting, flickering glow across the massive hull. The battle had moved into the final, most dangerous phase. The swarm was at the doorstep, and the United States Navy's most advanced carrier was about to find out if its silicon brain was faster than a wave of 400 hungry machines. 4:28 in the morning. The inner defensive perimeter of the USS Gerald R. Ford, less than 3 miles from the hull. The sky above the South China Sea was no longer dark. It was crisscrossed by the white-hot fingers of evolved Sea Sparrow missiles and the orange glows of burning debris falling toward the water. Despite the high-precision intercepts by the cruiser and the carrier's own mid-range missiles, the swarm had achieved its primary objective: saturation. For every drone destroyed, the remaining units used the wreckage and the smoke as a physical screen, closing the gap with terrifying speed. The drones were now within the minimum engagement range of the heavy missiles. It was time for the final, desperate layers of the ship's inner shield to wake up. On the forward and aft sponsons of the carrier, the rolling airframe missile launchers began their high-speed slewing. These systems were the ship's primary defense against agile, sea-skimming threats. Unlike the larger missiles, the rolling airframe missile is designed to spin rapidly in flight to maintain stability, a technical necessity that gave the weapon its name. At 2.5 miles, the first launcher fired. A sequence of 5 missiles ripped out of the canister in less than 3 seconds. The sound was a sharp, high-pitched shriek that cut through the heavy thrum of the carrier's engines. The missiles surged forward at over twice the speed of sound, their infrared seekers locking onto the heat generated by the small electric motors and friction of the drones. The air on the carrier's catwalks was now thick with the acrid stink of burnt cordite and the chemical bite of rocket propellant. Below the flight deck, in the damage control lockers, sailors waited in the dark, their breathing heavy inside their fire-retardant flash gear. They could feel the ship vibrating as the weapon systems worked. The vibration was not the steady pulse of the engines, but a jagged, rhythmic shuddering that told them the ship was fighting for its life. The rolling airframe missiles found their marks. In the dark, a mile and a half away, a series of bright white flashes illuminated the sea surface for a fraction of a second. Each flash represented a drone obliterated, its carbon fiber frame shredded by a blast fragmentation warhead. But the swarm was too large. One of the drone talons, numbering nearly 40 units, had found a blind spot in the sensor coverage by diving to within 3 meters of the waves. They were moving at 80 meters per second, a blurred mass of black shapes and whirring propellers. Engaged with the close-in weapon system, the tactical action officer commanded. All mounts. Sector Zulu. Weapons free. On the edges of the flight deck, the 3 Phalanx close-in, weapon systems massive. White-domed Gatling guns that resembled robotic sentries snapped toward the horizon. Their search radars locked onto the low-flying cluster. For a heartbeat, there was silence, and then the night was torn apart by a sound that resembled a giant piece of canvas being ripped in half. The 20mm Vulcan cannons began firing at a rate of 4,500 rounds per minute. A stream of red tracer fire erupted from the carrier's side, a solid line of glowing steel that reached out and slapped the surface of the water. The 20mm armor-piercing rounds were striking the sea, kicking up plumes of white spray that stood 10 meters high. The computer-controlled guns adjusted their aim in milliseconds, walking the stream of fire directly into the path of the incoming drones. The drones at the start front of the formation were simply erased. They did not explode so much as they disintegrated, turned into a cloud of dust and spinning fragments by the sheer volume of fire. The tracer fire looked like a physical wall, a barrier of light and kinetic energy that no machine could pass. The sea was littered with the sinking remains of the attackers, and the air was filled with the metallic clink-clink-clink of thousands of spent brass casings tumbling onto the deck and into the ocean. But even this wall had a limit. The cannons had to pause to reload or to shift targets as the swarm's remaining talons coordinated their arrival. The Chinese swarm had been programmed with a ruthless logic: sacrifice the many to ensure the success of the few. As the close-in weapon systems focused on the low-altitude threat to the hull, the final 80 drones, the largest remaining group, executed a high-altitude climb, reaching 500 meters directly above the carrier. The tactical displays in the Combat Direction Center showed the change in an instant. The dots on the screen were no longer closing from the side. They were growing larger as they began a near-vertical terminal dive toward the center of the ship. Incoming! Top-down attack! The radar operator yelled. The drones were no longer aiming for the armored hull. They were aiming for the flight deck, the most vulnerable and volatile square mile of real estate on the planet. The air above the ship was suddenly filled with the high-pitched whine of hundreds of tiny propellers accelerating in a gravity-assisted plunge. The inner shield had held the line at the horizon, but the ceiling was wide open. 4:30 in the morning. The flight deck of the USS Gerald R. Ford. The sky above the carrier was a chaotic tapestry of red tracers and white missile streaks. But the real threat was now coming from directly overhead at latitude 18 degrees 12 minutes north, longitude 112 degrees 45 minutes east. The air over the massive 4.5-acre flight deck, usually filled with the scent of salt spray and the roar of catapults, was suddenly choked by the acrid stench of burning electronics and the high-pitched whine of 80 drones entering their terminal attack phase. The ship's automated systems had prioritized the low-altitude threats, leaving a narrow window for the plunging swarm. 80 drones tilted their noses down, their electric motors screaming at maximum revolutions, as they converted altitude into raw kinetic energy. The first cluster of 15 drones focused on the forward section of the flight deck, where 3 FA-18 fighter jets were being prepared for an emergency launch. The trigger was pulled by an automated algorithm miles away. 12 drones slammed into the parked FA-18 fighters near Elevator 2, their shaped charge warheads punching through the thin aluminum skins and igniting the JP-5 fuel cells with a sound like a thunderclap that cracked eardrums across the deck. A massive fireball erupted instantly, rising 60 feet into the air and bleaching the sky white for 3 full seconds. The heat blast washed across the deck, a searing wall of 5,000 degrees that melted the plastic visors of the sailors standing 50 feet away. The pressure wave was a physical blow, throwing 3 deck crew members off their feet and sending pieces of a shattered jet engine flying across the landing strip like shrapnel. The deck crew, trained for the worst-case scenario, reacted with the cold discipline of the United States Navy. Despite the wall of orange flame and the rain of debris, the yellow shirts and purple shirts did not run away. They scrambled toward the fire, dragging heavy, rubber-lined hoses across the rough non-skid surface, while the ship's automated aqueous film-forming foam system triggered. A thick, white chemical blanket began to hiss as it hit the burning jet fuel, creating a dense cloud of steam that blotted out the remaining drones. The damage control teams moved in pairs, their breathing heavy and rhythmic inside their oxygen masks, pushing back the inferno 1 meter at a time. Black smoke rolled across the flight deck in oily, suffocating waves, blinding the optical landing systems and turning the most advanced warship in the world into a vision of industrial hell. Above the roar of the fire, the sound of secondary explosions began to ring out as the 20mm ammunition stored inside the burning fighters began to cook off, sending small, bright flashes through the smoke. On the bridge, the commanding officer felt the ship shudder as another 2 drones struck the Panos side of the island, the command tower that served as the brain of the vessel, the glass of the primary flight. Control windows shattered inward, showering the controllers in crystalline shards. The ship's internal communications network crackled with reports of casualties and hull breaches, but the voice of the damage control officer remained steady, a calm anchor in the center of the storm. Fire on the flight deck, frame 100 to 120. The report came through. Automated suppression is active. Teams are on site. We are holding the line. The carrier was heeling over at a sharp 15-degree angle as the helmsman continued to push the ship through a series of radical S-turns, trying to use the wind to blow the smoke away from the remaining parked aircraft. The South China Sea was no longer a silent witness. It was a boiling cauldron of foam and fire. The pride of the 7th Fleet was bleeding, but her heart was still beating. The immediate aftermath was a scene of controlled desperation. The largest fire was being contained, but the drones were not finished. Another 50 units were circling in the smoke, looking for a gap in the white foam where they could deliver a final, killing blow to the carrier's primary radar arrays. The deck was a slick, dangerous mess of chemical foam, jet fuel, and twisted metal. But the sailors of the Gerald R. Ford stood their ground, their eyes fixed on the darkening sky, waiting for the next wave to fall. 4:35 in the morning. The flight deck of the USS Gerald R. Ford was a landscape of white foam and orange fire. The primary damage control center, located deep within the armored citadel of the ship, was a hive of controlled, high-pressure communication. On the flight deck, the situation was a chaotic struggle between human discipline and chemical fury. The hit near Elevator 2 had created a Class Bravo fire, a liquid fuel conflagration that burned with a temperature of over 1,000 degrees. Thick, black smoke from the burning tires and composite skins of the FA-18 fighters rolled across the deck, reducing visibility to less than 5 meters. The sailors of Repair Locker 3 and Repair Locker 5 moved with a synchronization born of thousands of hours of drills. They were encased in heavy, aluminized firefighting ensembles that made them look like silver ghosts moving through the soot. Each man carried the weight of his breathing apparatus and the crushing pressure of the 1.5-inch charged fire hoses. The deck was slick, with a mixture of seawater and aqueous film-forming foam, a substance that resembled a thick, white dish soap but possessed the chemical properties to smother the oxygen out of a jet fuel fire. Direct the stream to the base of the landing gear. The scene leader shouted over the roar of the wind and the hiss of the foam. "We have to cool the ordnance before the 20-millimeter rounds cook off." The ship's commanding officer, standing on the bridge, despite the shattered glass crunching under his boots, made a strategic decision to assist the fire teams. He ordered the helmsman to increase speed to 35 knots and to bring the ship's head 30 degrees to starboard. This maneuver was designed to use the relative wind, now screaming across the deck at over 60 kilometers per hour, to literally blow the heat and the suffocating smoke off the port side of the ship and away from the primary damage control routes. As the massive carrier leaned into the turn, the burning JP-5 fuel began to run toward the scuppers, the drainage channels along the edge of the deck. The fire teams followed it, their very nozzles set to a wide fog pattern to create a thermal shield for the men behind them. The sound was a deafening cacophony of rushing air, the metallic groaning of the ship's hull, and the rhythmic thud-thud-thud of the secondary explosions within the wreckage of the aircraft. Below the flight deck, in the hangar bay, the atmosphere was equally tense. The massive blast doors had been slammed shut, isolating the fire above from the dozens of aircraft and thousands of tons of munitions stored below. The hangar bay's overhead sprinkler system was on standby, its nozzles dripping with anticipation. Sailors stood at the ready, with portable extinguishers and foam monitors, their eyes fixed on the ceiling, watching for any sign of heat-induced structural failure. The medical teams were already in motion. At the battle dressing stations located throughout the ship, corpsmen were treating the first wave of casualties. 3 sailors from the flight deck had been caught in the initial blast wave. They were being treated for second-degree burns and smoke inhalation. The ship's primary hospital suite, a facility as advanced as many regional trauma centers, was being prepped for surgery. The professionalism of the medical staff was a quiet, steady counterpoint to the violence occurring on the deck above. The smell of the sea was gone, replaced entirely by the acrid, choking stench of burnt rubber, scorched paint, and the chemical bite of the firefighting foam. Every surface of the flight deck was covered in a grayish-white sludge that made every movement a gamble. Yet, the work continued. The fire was being pushed back, narrowed down to the twisted, blackened skeletons of the destroyed fighters. On the island, the electronics technicians were working frantically to bypass the damaged sensors. The two drones that had struck, the command tower had destroyed a secondary radar array, but the primary ANSPY-6 system was still operational, though its software was struggling to filter out the interference caused by the massive clouds of smoke and steam rising from the deck. The Gerald R. Ford was proving why she was built with redundant systems and a crew of 4,500 of the most highly trained personnel in the world. The ship was wounded, but she was far from defeated. As the fire was brought under control, the focus of the command team shifted back to the horizon. The drone swarm had been thinned, but the remaining 60 units were regrouping for their final run. The deck was still hot, the foam was still deep, but the guns were being reloaded. 4:40 in the morning. The bridge and the electronic warfare bays of the USS Gerald R. Ford. The ship's primary physical defenses had been pushed to the breaking point, but the battle was now shifting into a silent, invisible spectrum. Below the flight deck, in the climate-controlled sanctum of the electronic warfare modules, technical specialists were operating the AN/SLQ-32 Golf Electronic Warfare Suite. This system, part of the Surface Electronic Warfare Improvement Program Block 3, was designed to do more than just listen to enemy signals. It was a high-power weapon in its own right, capable of projecting concentrated beams of electromagnetic energy that could fry the delicate gallium nitride circuits of an incoming drone at a distance of 5 miles. The air in the electronic warfare bay was thick with the smell of ozone and the dry, sterilized scent of high-capacity cooling units. On the tactical monitors, the remaining 60 drones were visible as a cluster of fluctuating heat maps. They were no longer flying in a simple formation. They were weaving in and out of each other's flight paths, a defensive tactic meant to distribute the electronic load across their mesh network. By sharing processing power, the swarm was attempting to create a digital shield that could withstand the carrier's jamming attempts. The swarm is using frequency hopping at a rate of 10,000 cycles per second, the senior electronic warfare technician reported, his voice calm despite the flickering lights on his console. They are trying to find a gap in our white noise blanket, requesting permission to initiate the active electronic attack, focused beam, 80 gigahertz. The commanding officer gave the order from the bridge. Initiate the attack. Burn them out. Across the external hull of the carrier, the 4 massive, active, electronically scanned arrays of the SLQ-32 began to pulse with invisible power. The energy being projected was so intense that it created a localized field of static electricity along the ship's catwalks. Sailors working near the sponsons felt the hair on their arms stand up, and a faint, blue St. Elmo's fire began to dance along the edges of the shattered glass on the bridge windows. The South China Sea, dark and churning below, seemed to reflect the invisible struggle as the surface tension of the water was disturbed by the high-frequency vibrations. The effect on the swarm was immediate and catastrophic. The lead drones, which had been coordinating the final diving maneuver, suddenly lost their ability to communicate with the rest of the group. Their internal flight controllers, bombarded by millions of watts of focused energy, began to glitch. On the radar screens, 12 dots suddenly veered off course, their gyroscopes failing, as they performed wild, uncontrolled loops before slamming into the water at 300 kilometers per hour. The invisible wall of the electronic siege was holding, but the swarm's artificial intelligence was programmed to learn. The remaining 48 units suddenly dropped their altitude to less than 5 meters, using the physical curvature of the Earth and the swell of the waves to mask their signatures from the direct line-of-sight electronic beams. They were no longer using a mesh network. They had switched to an autonomous, pre-programmed attack profile that required no external communication. They were flying silent and blind, relying on their internal inertial navigation systems to find the massive hull of the carrier. "They've gone dark," the radar operator called out. "I have no signal to jam. They are running on internal logic now." The tactical atmosphere on the ship shifted instantly. The electronic warfare specialists had done their job, thinning the herd and breaking the swarm's coordination, but the remaining drones were now like unguided bullets locked onto a final coordinate. The humidity of the morning air seemed to thicken, and the smell of the sea was heavy with the lingering scent of the flight deck fires. The carrier was still moving at 35 knots, but the drones were closing the final 2 miles. In the Combat Direction Center, the Tactical Action Officer looked at the screen. The remaining drones were now too low for the rolling airframe missiles, and too spread out for the heavy guns. The defense was down to the final layer, the crew's ability to physically spot and engage the small, dark shapes as they emerged from the sea spray. All lookouts, eyes on the water, the bridge commander radioed. They are coming in low, and they are coming in fast. Shift all Phalanx mounts to manual override. The electronic siege had ended in a stalemate. The invisible battle of frequencies had been won by the United States Navy, but the physical reality of 48 high-explosive drones was still screaming across the water. The ship's interior lights flickered, as the power-hungry electronic warfare suite was dialed back to reserve levels, and for a moment, there was a heavy, pregnant silence on the bridge, broken only by the rushing wind and the rhythmic thud of the sea against the bow. The final act was about to begin. The carrier had endured the fire and the ghosts on the screen. Now, it had to endure the impact. 4:45 in the morning. The final engagement zone. 300 meters from the island of the USS Gerald R. Ford. The 400 drones that had begun the attack were now reduced to the final 48 units, but these were the most dangerous. They were the survivors, the ones that had navigated a gauntlet of missiles, electronic jamming, and Gatling gunfire. They were no longer flying in a coordinated swarm. They were individual projectiles, each carrying a 3-kilogram high-explosive warhead, closing the final distance at 80 meters per second. The air around the carrier's island was a vortex of heat, smoke, and the high-pitched scream of electric motors. The final cluster of 30 drones crested the last wave at a distance of 500 meters, emerging from the dark like a pack of mechanical wolves. On the starboard sponson, the gunner for the Mark 38 25mm chain gun clamped his hands onto the spade grips and squeezed the trigger. The weapon erupted with a bone-shaking thud thud thud, sending a stream of high-explosive incendiary rounds into the dark. The muzzle flashes were blinding, casting jagged shadows across the white foam still covering the flight deck. The smell of burnt cordite was overpowering, a sharp, metallic bite that filled the gunner's lungs as he traversed the barrel. One drone took a direct hit to its central hub, spinning wildly for a second before its battery cell ignited in a brilliant green flash. But 3 others followed the path of the tracers, accelerating into their final plunge. The lead drone punched through the reinforced glass of the bridge's secondary observation level, detonating instantly against the heavy steel chart table. The blast wave threw the navigation officer across the compartment, the pressure compressing every chest in the room. As a fireball bleached the interior white for 2 full seconds, shrapnel from the drone's carbon fiber casing shredded the leather seats and embedded itself into the overhead wiring, causing a cascade of sparks to rain down from the ceiling. The air was suddenly filled with the roar of rushing wind and the high-pitched screaming of high-voltage alarms. The temperature in the room spiked as the fire from the drone's propellant found a stack of paper charts, sending a pillar of orange flame toward the overhead. The bridge crew reacted with instant, practiced desperation. The helmsman, bleeding from a superficial cut on his forehead where a glass shard had grazed him, kept his hands locked on the wheel, fighting to maintain the carrier's 35-knot turn against the resistance of the sea. To his left, the commanding officer grabbed the emergency radio, his voice steady even as the smell of ozone and burnt insulation filled his lungs. Damage control teams already on the flight deck pivoted toward the island, dragging their heavy, rubber-lined foam lines through the twisted debris of the earlier strikes. They did not wait for orders. They moved into the black smoke billowing from the observation level, their boots crunching on broken glass and jagged pieces of aluminum. The last of the drones splashed into the wake of the carrier, their fuel exhausted or their sensors blinded by the ship's relentless defensive fire. A dead silence fell over the bridge for exactly 3 seconds, broken only by the whistling of the wind through the shattered windows, and the distant, muffled hiss of the firefighting foam still being sprayed onto the flight deck. The swarm was gone. The radar screens, once filled with hundreds of flickering yellow ghosts, were now clear. The South China Sea was once again a dark, empty expanse, save for the burning wreckage of the drones bobbing in the carrier's white wake. All drones neutralized, the tactical action officer reported, his voice cracking with exhaustion. Clear air on all sectors. The engagement is over. The bridge of the Gerald R. Ford was a scene of industrial wreckage. The primary flight control station was a blackened shell, and the air was thick with the gray dust of fire extinguishers. But the ship was still moving. The 4 propellers were still pushing the 100,000 tons of steel through the water at 30 knots. The United States Navy had held the line, but the cost was visible in every flickering light, and every wounded sailor being carried toward the elevators. The commanding officer looked out through the jagged hole where the windows had been. To the east, the first faint line of gray was appearing on the horizon. The dawn was coming, and with it, the full realization of what they had survived. The carrier was scarred. Her flight deck was a graveyard of aircraft and machines, but she was still afloat, and her flag was still flying in the salt-heavy wind. 5:15 in the morning. The USS Gerald R. Ford began to slow, her 4 massive propellers cutting the speed to 10 knots, as the first weak light of dawn touched the eastern horizon. The South China Sea was the color of bruised slate, the water choppy and cold under a rising wind that carried away the last of the black smoke from the flight deck. The carrier was a silhouette of industrial trauma. On the bridge, the commanding officer stood amidst the wreckage of his command center, looking out through the jagged teeth of the shattered windows. The air inside the bridge still tasted of dry fire extinguisher powder and the metallic tang of burnt wiring. Below him, the 4.5-acre flight deck was no longer the pristine, gray surface of a premier airfield. It was a landscape of charred circles, white chemical foam, and the twisted, blackened skeletons of 3 FA-18 fighter jets. The initial battle assessment was delivered by the executive officer, his voice raspy from smoke inhalation, but steady with professional resolve. The human cost was the first priority. 11 sailors had been killed in action, most of them members of the flight deck crew, caught in the initial top-down drone strikes. 42 others were being treated in the ship's primary medical ward, ranging from superficial shrapnel wounds to severe respiratory distress. Each name was being recorded with the meticulous care of the United States Navy. The paperwork for the families, already beginning its grim journey back to the mainland. The damage to the ship's primary systems was significant, but not catastrophic. The hit on the island had destroyed a secondary communication array and scorched the primary flight control windows, but the nuclear reactors remained. At 100% capacity, the AN/SPY-6 radar was still sweeping the sky, its digital eyes searching for any sign of a follow-up attack. Of the 75 aircraft currently embarked, 3 were total losses, and another 5 had sustained varying degrees of shrapnel damage to their vertical stabilizers and engine cowlings. The swarm is confirmed neutralized, the executive officer reported, tapping a blackened glass screen. 400 individual units entered the engagement zone. 388 were destroyed by kinetic intercepts, and 12 were crashed by the electronic warfare suite. No enemy units escaped the perimeter. The logistics of recovery were already in motion. On the flight deck, a massive bulldozer, its yellow paint scorched and peeling, was pushing the remains of a destroyed fighter jet toward the edge of the deck. With a heavy, metallic groan, the wreckage was jettisoned into the sea, clearing space for the remaining aircraft to be rearranged. Sailors with heavy push brooms and high-pressure hoses were scrubbing the non-skid surface, washing the white foam and the last of the fuel residue into the drainage scuppers. To the south, the cruiser CG-73 and the destroyer DDG-51 were closing the distance to rejoin the carrier. The escort ships had expended over 60% of their vertical launch system magazines, and their hulls were streaked with salt and the soot of their own defensive fires. At 6 in the morning, the fast combat support ship, the USNS Supply, appeared on the horizon. The replenishment at sea would begin within the hour, transferring thousands of tons of ordnance and fuel to replace what had been consumed. In the 40-minute engagement, the strategic report was being drafted for Command Center. The military forces had faced the largest coordinated drone swarm in the history of naval warfare and remained operational. The aircraft carrier had proven that while the shield could be pierced, the iron heart of a carrier strike group was designed to absorb the blow and continue the fight. The air on the bridge was cold now, the wind whistling through the broken glass, but the feeling of relief was tempered by the knowledge that this was only the first test. As the sun cleared the horizon, the flag on the carrier's stern was illuminated, its red and white stripes standing out against the gray sea. The flight deck was being cleared, the ammunition was being reloaded, and the survivors were standing their watch. The aircraft carrier was still the most powerful piece of sovereign territory on the ocean, and her mission in the South China Sea was only beginning.